Hello. So, as I talked about in class, once you get your rough draft completed, you're going to go through a short series of screencasts. And each screencast is going to talk about one part or a couple of parts of your narrative. So you're going to watch the screencast, you're going to go back to your rough draft, and then you're going to make changes to your narrative to make it better based on the information that you got in the screencast. So I'm going to give you lots of examples. I'm going to talk about some different ways that you can make some revisions and changes to make your rough draft even better before I go through and start reading it and looking at it. And so this is what we're going to be spending our time doing over the next few days in class. So the first screencast in the series here is all about one specific part of your exposition, the narrative hook. And so this is where you want to hook in your reader, hence the hook here. So what is the narrative hook? I know I talked about this in class the other day. I didn't spend a ton of time on it, but now I want to spend a little bit more time on it for you. This is where you hook the reader's interest. It's also could be called something like an attention getter, but in a narrative we call it a narrative hook. You reel them in by catching their attention and make them want to know more about your characters and more about your story. It's usually your first few lines or your first few paragraphs leading into your exposition. So here's a couple of great narrative hooks from recent young adult novels that you may or may not have heard of or read. The first is from The Fault in Our Stars. As we know in that story, the two main characters have both been stricken with cancer. Augustus is the main character and the narrator, and these are the first few lines. Late in the winter of my 17th year, my mother decided I was depressed, presumably because I rarely left the house, spent quite a lot of time in bed, read the same book over and over, ate infrequently, and devoted quite a bit of my abundant free time to thinking about death. So right away, before you know anything about the book, you're like asking questions such as, why is he depressed? Why is he spending so much time in the house? Why does he read the same book over and over again? And what book is it? And why is he thinking so much about death? If you know the book, which I know many of you do, Fault in Our Stars, you know that all this has to do with Augustus being ill from cancer and having his leg amputated. The next one is from a book called Destroy Me. And the narrative hook is nice and short, but it leaves you with lots of questions. So here it is. I've been shot. And as it turns out, a bullet wound is even more uncomfortable than I had imagined. So right off the bat, we are jumping right in the action. We're also hinting at the conflict here too, right? He's been shot. We want to know why he's been shot, just how uncomfortable it is, why he's thought about getting shot and how uncomfortable it would be, and why he's imagined this. And so all sorts of things just within this one or these two little sentences really hook us in. Next one is from Divergent, and it goes like this. There's one mirror in my house. It is behind a sliding panel in the hallway upstairs. Our faction allows me to stand in front of it on the second day of every third month, the day my mother cuts my hair. So you're left again with all sorts of questions if you haven't read this book. Why is there only one mirror? Why is it hidden behind a panel? What's a faction, and why do they get their hair cut on such a tight schedule? It seems very rigid on the second day of every third month. Why such a schedule? And the last one is from Monster by Walter Dean Myers, which I think some of you have read as well. The best time to cry is at night, when the lights are out and someone is being beaten up and screaming for help. That way, even if you sniffle a little, they won't hear you. If anybody knows that you are crying, they'll start talking about it, and soon it'll be your turn to get beat up when the lights go out. So right away you're asking yourself, the conflict is clear, right? That someone is trying to survive either in a prison or some kind of concentration camp or something along those lines. Wondering why they might be crying, why people are getting beat up, and you're thinking just how rough it must be to be held prisoner in whatever this is, and you want to know more. So, a few pieces of advice for you on narrative hooks as you begin your revision journey. One thing that I see sometimes in narrative hooks or in expositions from students is that they mention something, they introduce a dad or maybe hint at some sort of conflict, but then we never hear about it again. You only have 2 to 4 pages here, you guys, so use your time really well and really wisely. Choose very wisely. You don't need any extra extraneous information. Now, there's this really cool Latin term, and I know you guys know I like to think about Latin and Greek things. So it goes in media res. And that's Latin for this idea of into the middle of things. A great way to start your narrative hook is to just jump into the inciting incident, especially in a short story. We don't need a ton of backstory. We don't need a ton of exposition. If you've chosen a story that needs a ton of backstory and exposition, I would really rethink reshaping it so you don't need all that, cutting out all that extra stuff that maybe doesn't really matter when it comes down to it. To your climax and your conflict. Great place to start is right where things get ugly, right where the events take the turn for the worst, or where there's like a major revelation for a character. So here's an example, another example from Their Ancient and Glittering Eyes by Ron Rash. And it goes, because they were boys, no one believed them, including the old men who gathered each morning at the Riverside Gas and Grocery. So the great thing about this narrative hook is it also gets some of the stuff out of the way that we need in our exposition. I'm going to talk about that in Screencast too. Right away, we're introduced to some of the characters. They're boys. They're kids. They're innocent, usually, but maybe not necessarily reliable, right? No one believed them. Also, what is it that they did? What are they not being believed about? So right away, there's a conflict set up. They're not being believed. We need to know more about what it is, and we want to find out. So the older men, they're kind of the elders or the voices of reason. So we have perhaps a very clear conflict set up of person versus person, right? Or group versus group. We have the setting. It's kind of a small mom and pop, little tiny grocery store, country grocery store. And then we have this thing which no one believed. Sounds like a conflict to me. There's the hook. It's a great hook, and it's all in one sentence. Bingo, bango. Next one is this idea of an iceberg. Try maybe hinting at something more to come. An iceberg, right? We see just the very tip on the outside of the water, but underneath the water, there's so much more. So in your narrative hook, you can hint at relationships, emotional baggage, events, and conflicts that might be escalating or building. There should be some kind of urgency and importance to what is going on in your narrative hook. Maybe give little clues as to what the story is about, what your theme is, kind of point your reader and get their mindset in a certain direction. For instance, if your story is about loss, you've got to set something up for your character to lose first. If the story is about redemption, then something has to go wrong first, and then they have to have the chance to redeem themselves, right? Make themselves better. So here's an example from a short story from the previous author called Not Waving, but Drowning. Across the room, a woman holds her front teeth in the palm of her hand. Whoa! She's holding her teeth in the palm of her hand. It's kind of brutal. It's kind of short, but like, what's going on? Why does she have teeth in her hands? Are they her dentures? Why is she just standing there? Did someone punch her? Did she deserve it? What is going on? There's so much more beneath the surface here, and I want to read more and learn more to find out. So, here are a bunch of hooks that are not actually hooks, okay? This is a great way to maybe look at what you have already and decide, ooh, maybe this isn't the best hook. So, first, descriptions. By just describing a person or a room, it's not enough. That's very boring. So here's an example of something that's really boring. That's a description. Betty was a tall blonde girl, skinny, who was easy on the eyes. Boring. How about this? Betty rubbed the new tattoo on the small of her back, squinted into the setting sun, and revved the engine of her candy apple red 1966 Mustang, waiting for Bobby to cross the street. Awesome. We've got tension, which is hinting at conflict, and lots of imagery about who Betty is, right? Way more interesting than that first description where it's just telling rather than showing. Another thing that's not a hook here is where you're just describing a setting. A vivid scene isn't a hook unless it's a big part of your story. So, for instance, the tall oak trees cast long shadows over the house. Yeah, and this is kind of boring. It doesn't really mean anything. How about, I watched the tall oaks cast their shadows over the yard and the swimming pool where my son drowned, as I wondered if I'd ever feel anything again. This is way better. The setting isn't necessarily the focus. It's the conflict and perhaps that protagonist main character, right? Something else that's not a hook, just starting off with straight up action. Just because something's happening doesn't mean that it's necessarily important. So, James closed the door, ran down the stairs, and hurried to catch the bus. It's kind of boring. Who really cares, right? How about this? James closed the door to his new apartment. He had recently been kicked out of his parents' house after his arrest, and as the 21 bus rumbled past, he mumbled under his breath, "Great, late for work again." So, again, we've accomplished more than just a narrative hook here. We also have a potential conflict. We know a little bit about the characters, so we've built some characterization. And we've gotten in some setting and some action, right? So instead of just doing one thing, we just did 5 things. So the other thing about narrative hooks is we don't want to just give boring dialogue. So, for instance, if we're going to use dialogue, we need to be able to cover some more of the tracks. It rarely really works as an opening. I've got a great example here where it does. So, here's an example where it doesn't work. What time should I be there? We don't know who's speaking. We don't know where they are. Your reader is totally in the dark. We want to enlighten your reader. So here's a better example where we also work in some setting and some conflict and characterization too for the protagonist and the antagonist. I'll be there at sunset on the south side of the beach pier. And listen, if you screw me over again this time, it'll be your son, Big Al threatened on the other end of the line as Tom shakily held the phone to his ear. Whoa, dun dun dun. We want to know what's going on. Who's Big Al? Sounds like a gangster or something. What's going on? Does Tom owe him money? Why is he threatening him? Why is Tom so nervous? I want to know more. Great narrative hook. The other thing that's not a good hook is backstory. In a short story, you really cannot have too much backstory because it gets too cumbersome. So don't open with boring, dry facts about what people do or did. So for example, Bob lived in the suburbs, was recently retired, and worked in his garden when he wasn't watching Matlock. Boring. How about this? Instead, work some backstory in over time, but maybe open with something that leads us kind of down that path. It was in the suburbs of Chicago, where Bob worked in his garden, burying things, covering them up, because they were always watching, even when Matlock was on. So you've also worked in some conflict there, right? As well as the main character, Bob. Who is Bob? Why is he burying things? And who is always watching him? Conflict, right? So, now that you've watched this video, now what can you do? You have a really valuable chance here to revise your narrative hook to really pull your reader in and to really make it better and to improve it. So, you can really polish your hook. You're going to get the same chance with the other parts of your story too. What you need to do now is go back to your rough draft. I would suggest highlighting your narrative hook in a certain color and really work in it. And the next just so you know, the next video, your next screencast is going to be about the exposition and the rising action. So everything's sort of leading up to your climax. Good luck, and may the writing gods be with you as you revise your narrative hook.